think we should go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Pat Soldano, President of Family Enterprise USA and Policy and Taxation Group. Family Enterprise USA promotes generationally owned family businesses and their lifetimes of savings at a national level in Washington, D.C., all sizes of business and all industries. Policy and Taxation Group, as most of you know, supports and promotes family offices and successful individuals on tax and economic issues that affect them at a national level in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us for the call today. So first of all, I want to make sure everyone understands that you are on mute and you're not on video, but we really would like this call to be interactive, and you can feel free to ask any questions, and you can do that in the Q&A, you can do that in the chat, and we will monitor that as best we can. So again, please do that. We want your questions. If you're not a supporter of either organizations and you are a family office or a family business, we can't do this work without your support. So we really appreciate it if you would go on our websites, Family Enterprise USA, Policy and Taxation Group, and become a member, become a supporter, and support the work that we do in Washington, D.C. I will remind you that Family Enterprise USA is a 501c3, so family foundations can support our work. Policy and Taxation Group is a 501c4. So today we have a slight change in the agenda, and I'm going to walk through that. Unfortunately, Frank Luntz has had an emergency and he cannot be on this call with us today. So we still have some excellent speakers and some very interesting update information for you to talk about on the call today. So Mark Warren and Russ Sullivan from the Brownstein law firm are going to talk to us about congressional budget proposals and pending legislative proposals, as well as the IRS audits, which are becoming more and more extensive, especially, as you all know, for anyone that earns over $400,000 a year. Then we're going to have Luke Walwork, who is the Member Services and Coalition Director for the House Small Business Committee, and Ryan Dilworth, who is Legislative Director for Tax Issues for Representative Beth Van Dyne, Republican of Texas. And then Michael Hawthorne, who's also on the call from Squire Patton Boggs, is going to give us an update on the Congressional Family Business Caucus. So with that, and if we have some time at the end, I'm happy to share some of our results of our Family Enterprise USA 2024 annual survey. We did disclose some of those results, preliminary results, when we were in DC last month at the caucus meeting, but we have some final results now and some additional results that we can share. If we don't share those today, you should know that we are doing presentations around the country. Happy to do that for you and your group. So please let us know. We will also be doing some of that at the May 14th caucus meeting, which I'll mention again, Congressional Family Business Caucus meeting that we are facilitating in Washington, D.C. So without that, with no further ado, as they say, Mark Warren, I'm going to turn it over to you because I think you're going to share your slides.
I'm going to try to share my screen here.
And while Mark does, let me introduce this segment. I'm Russ Sullivan. We are pleased to talk to you about what is happening in Congress and what we're gearing up for 2025. I don't have to tell any of you it's an election year. You figured that out so far. There's a point at which every year that ends in a even number, things sort of slow down in terms of passing legislation in Washington. The same has occurred this year. That does not mean there's not action, because there actually is a lot of action behind the scenes. So we're going to talk you through what proposals have been put forth for consideration, which ones are still in development, as we gear up for what most people, including Mark and I, believe will be a very significant change in our tax policy by the end of 2025, either by legislative action or by congressional inaction. So as you may have recalled from previous elections, sometimes legislators are the leaders in developing ideas that presidential candidates use once they get elected. But not this time. This time, the presidential candidates are large and in charge when it comes to economic policy and tax proposals. And so both the Trump team and the Biden team have agendas that they will pursue in 2025. We're going to tell you what those are today and how those proposals are evolving and a little bit about their chances for enactment. So first, we're going to talk about President Trump, or former President Trump and candidate Trump. And I'm going to turn over to Mark to sort of outline what would his agenda be with regard to taxes should he win in November.
Thanks, Russ. I think this is going to be interesting because, in a way, this is kind of the second season of the miniseries for both of these administrations. We've seen 4 years of both. So if we look back to the first 4 years of the Trump administration, 2017 through 21, what we saw with the 2016 Tax Act, 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a number of changes on the business side, everything from the very small businesses up through family-owned businesses of all different sizes to the large multinational corporations. And most of the business provisions were permanent. A lot of the individual side was temporary. And I think that for the Trump administration, the priority is going to be trying to make all of that permanent. But Washington has changed a lot in the 4 years since the end of the Trump administration, the first one. And there's been a lot more emphasis, both in terms of kind of a populist view, which you can really see with the new chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith from Missouri. And kind of his focus is not so much changing kind of the Republican priorities, but how they talk about them and how they sort of present them to the public, to constituents, but also within the legislature. And he generally kind of talks about all the issues in terms of families, farms, and small business. And, I think he latches on to small business simply because of his district, which is one of the most kind of poor districts and rural in the country. So I think he's got a lot, we know he's got a lot of family-owned businesses there, but they tend to be on the smaller side, and a lot of agricultural businesses. But, kind of trying to look at this from a more populist point of view, in terms of kind of keeping tax rates lower, making sure that the policies are supportive of investment, cost expensing for the kind of small or medium-sized businesses. Sometimes you hear of 179 expensing versus bonus depreciation. All of those components were in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and I think they will be looking to try to extend that as much as possible. But at the same time, there's kind of a renewed emphasis on doing it in a way that is kind of more fiscally balanced. Given that the deficit has continued to grow and the debt now is over $30 trillion, I think that is starting to weigh on a lot of legislators on both sides of the aisle. And I think the Trump administration, while the former president, I think, is more comfortable with debt from a business perspective, having that much national debt, I think, is going to definitely be an issue. So I think we're going to be in an environment if President Trump were to get a second term, and depending on how Congress kind of works out after the election, I think the kind of general trend right now is that the House would likely flip to the Democrats and that the Senate may flip back to the Republicans. But in either case, it's going to be a very thin margin. So trying to get a lot of these policies, back in place and to be made permanent is going to mean that there's going to have to be some additional revenues raised. And that's going to be a really significant battle. I think the Democrats have focused very heavily on the high-end individuals, high earners, and very large corporations. but the corporate rate itself may actually be back on the table from both sides of the aisle. So it's going to be we have a little bit of a history and kind of looking glass to see where some of this may go. And I think we've got a roadmap in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But in the end, I think this new kind of populist view and the emphasis on fiscal balance is gonna bring in some new provisions, some new potentially tax increases that we're going to have to struggle with to make sure that they don't adversely affect family-owned businesses in particular.
So, Mark, the framework of populism that you outlined, and even Jason Smith's framework of families, farms, and small businesses, that could work pretty well for all the TCJA extensions, because we're talking about individual rates applicable to families, talking about the child tax credit, the standard deduction, those kinds of things. And then 199A would, cover all pass-through businesses, and that's certainly going to be on the table as well. Let me ask you a couple of questions. One on Trump. Does he want anything outside of what was in TCJ? Has he announced anything? We've heard discussions around Washington that he may think the corporate rate should go even lower. Do you expect him to make some modifications or proposals that are other than just extending or making permanent TCJA?
But absolutely. I think his campaign has talked about, and he sort of hinted about trying to get the corporate rate down lower. When Congress was working on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in 2017, the target, at least on the Senate side, was 20%. And President Trump at that point pushed very hard to try to bring it down to 15%. But the kind of budget process, the reconciliation process that Congress was using at the time really didn't allow for that low of a rate in order to be able to get the broad-based tax reform done. I think the other thing here where he may go outside of what's on the table is, and this is the whole kind of international tax world that has developed in the last 4 years, and it's probably not all that won't have that much of an impact on even larger family-owned businesses. But Congress is going to have to respond with all of these countries adopting the global minimum tax, and depending on how they do that, or I think in Trump's case, what he may do is say, look, the United States is not joining this global minimum tax deal, and I don't like the fact that other countries are adopting all of these laws that are then going to, tax U.S. companies because they're paying too little under this global arrangement. So I'm just going to impose a whole bunch of tariffs. So we may see the cousin of, straight income taxes, the tariffs applied, and that was a popular tool for him in the first 4 years. But that there could be a trade war in response to some of these global developments, global minimum tax developments that we've seen. So, and it's hard to say what happens between now and the election, or even like during the processing of the TCJA. The White House came out with a number of new ideas kind of on the spur of the moment. But they also did not tend during the first campaign, or really even during the administration, to put out very formal kind of paper proposals that kind of fleshed out these details.
All right, Mark, two more quick questions. One going back to 199A. As I recall, that was not in the original Trump proposal, but was kind of added in the legislative process to reduce the disparity between the effective corporate rate and the effect on pass-through businesses. Do you think Trump has really warmed to that, and that will really be part of his agenda, or is that going to require Republicans in Congress to champion that should the Republicans win in November?
Yeah, I think it's going to take more on the congressional side for them to make sure he's on board. The fact that it was in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which he sees as a kind of a legacy of his, will help cement it. But I think Republicans are going to need to drive it home. And in particular, I think Republicans in Congress are going to need to keep working on the other side of the aisle to make sure that we see the kind of bipartisan support for that provision. And it is all based on the rates that are in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So if we end up having a compromise at the end, like we did in 2012 when the Bush tax cuts ultimately were resolved, if the top rate, for instance, goes back up, that 20% deduction in order to keep the corporate rate, and also if the corporate rate goes up, well, the amount of the deduction may need to be redialed in order to be able to keep the equivalence between the two, the corporate rate structure and the pass-through rate structure.
All right. Finally, you talked about offsets and that the more populist Republicans are for paying for the package, maybe through spending, but also through tax increases. What are some of these big offsets? Is it the SALT limitation? Is it the deduction for personal exemptions that were repealed that would spring back if Congress didn't act? What are the 3 or 4, and are any of them of concern to family-owned businesses?
Well, certainly on the individual side, the misunderstanding about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is, people think it was just a $1.5 trillion tax cut, but it really was a $5.5 trillion tax cut with $4 trillion worth of offsets. And on the individual side, the couple that you mentioned, the SALT limitation was the biggest offset there. I expect that will be clearly on the table. Whether it raises as much now as it did back then is a big question, because a lot of states have adopted these kind of workarounds so that pass-through business owners can work around the limitation and deduct their full amount of state income or state income taxes. But the limitations on itemized deductions is another one. I think the top rate, again, looking back at 2012, the top 2 rates, went back up after the Bush tax cuts. So, I think the top rate, and I think the corporate rate, even Chairman Smith has indicated that, it's something that would have to be on the table to be considered. So there could be some, compromise, I guess, in which there were some adjustments to rates there.
All right, let's move on to the Democrats and Biden, and I'll kind of cover some of this, and Mark, you'll cover some of it as well. Let's go to the next slide. So we know what President Biden's going to propose in his campaign and what he's going to pursue, because he put it out in his budget last month. He put pen to paper, and we have some significant details. Now, a lot of these he's had for several years since his first year in office. Some of them are modifications. In total, he has put forth $5 trillion in tax increases. We've listed here some of the ones that are applicable to pass-through businesses and individuals, but he's got a whole nother set of $3 trillion in corporate and international tax increases. Half of that is just increasing the corporate rate to 28%. But here we have a broad range of tax rates that are increased. There are some increases in the estate and gift tax, and then some other items that come out to about $2 trillion. So let's cover these in a little more detail. So the next slide talks about the tax rate increases. Mark?
Right. So kind of looking at the main ones, as I mentioned into your prior question, Russ, that the top rate, the 39.6 prior to TCJA, currently it's 37%. The president has proposed to move that up really immediately starting this year if it were enacted, so it could be retroactive. although I would expect them to adjust the dates if we're talking about next year. But I think the even more significant part of this is that the bracket would drop down to 450,000 for a married couple, 400,000 for a single person. And right now, the top 37% rate starts at $731,000 for a married couple. So that is going to widen that top bracket significantly, in addition to raising the rate. And on top of that, what they are proposing again this year is to eliminate the capital gains preference rate, the 20%, and for individuals, married couples that have income of over $1 million, and subject all of their capital gains to the top rate, again, presumably 39.6 under the budget. And on top of that, they would add the net investment income tax, which I think, Russ, you had a little hand in going back to the Obamacare legislation. That right now, under current law, the NIT is applicable only to capital gain or to investment earnings, not to active earnings. So they would do a couple things with that. They would expand it so that it applied to all types of income, both passive and active, as well as increase the rate to 5% from the 3.8% that it is right now. So I think putting those two together, really what potentially you could see in terms of capital gains at very high income would be a top rate of 44.6% on capital gains instead of what we have now. And then kind of the last piece is there's been obviously a lot of concern going back through a number of election cycles with high income people not paying as much, Warren Buffett not paying as much as his secretary. So the administration has a proposal for a 25% minimum tax, but this would be on individuals that have income of over $100 million. But that $100 million just isn't just earned income. That's also unrealized gains. So if you have stock that you've been holding for a number of years with significant appreciation that is just unrealized because you haven't sold it, that would have to be factored into that $100 million threshold, and then the 25% would apply. Now you'd get credit for whatever taxes you paid in terms of income tax, but the 25% would top up so that you'd make sure you had a minimum tax amount there.
All right, let's go to the next slide. That's the bulk. That's 1.8 trillion of the 2 trillion. The estate and gift tax proposals are similar to his previous year, and they expected to raise about 100 billion, according to the Treasury Department. So in this context, there are several different provisions. I'll focus a little bit on the grantor trust, referred to here as GRATs. So both the administration and Senator Wyden, the chair of the Finance Committee, have sort of converged on several ideas. Their view is that the grantor trust do allow individuals to plan and either reduce or avoid certain gift tax or certain capital gains taxes that they believe should be applied. And so they've come up with a series of changes to grantor trust that requires a minimum 10-year term in the administration. I believe Senator Wyden wants a 15-year term, disallowing decreases in the annuity during the GRAT term, and then sort of transactions between the trust and the deemed owner of the trust. Either way, sales from one to the other, they really want to treat those as sales and tax to be paid upon those transactions. There are a number of other things related to, but that would probably be the main items in that category. There are some other items you see on this, including sort of interaction with some of the other items, because the administration wants to increase capital gains rate and expand when it applies. They have specified that death would be a recognition event for capital gains purposes, and therefore people would pay the either 20%, or if the Biden budget is adopted in a Democratic Congress, 39.6% capital gains rate at death, and then also those assets be included in the estate tax. So you can see we get a very high rate of taxation on the appreciation on assets.
So Russ, let me ask you on that one in particular, if and this was also on the other slide, if the proposal to treat gifts and other transfers as taxable events, and death basically as a taxable event, doesn't this really eliminate the kind of indirectly the step up in basis? There'd be nothing left to step up, right?
That's correct. Because you would pay tax on all that step up from capital gains perspective. So your fair market value when you receive the asset would be the same as the value. So that's right. But you paid 80% on the appreciation at that point. Right. Federal, ignoring any state tax. All right, the final set would be some miscellaneous items that could affect family-owned businesses. There's a provision regarding businesses that are put into IRAs, large accumulation and retirement accounts. There's also some modification of private placement life insurance that both Biden administration and Senator Wyden have put forth. The repeal of like-kind exchange deferral is unlikely to get enacted. But you can also see carried interest here and donor advised funds. So Pat, that's a general overview of the $2 trillion that the Democrats are proposing. And if they sweep the elections, we're going to see all of these on the table, as well as perhaps some others that you and I and others battled back in 2021.
So thank you both for that. We had a lot of questions that registered signed up. When they signed up, they asked these questions, and I've been looking at them, and I think both of you have answered many of them, but there are a few that you haven't talked about. So let's start with the first one, and that is, what about the likelihood of the current tax bill that we all know is sitting in the Senate that was passed by the House?
Yeah,
I think we would call. Well, I'll let Mark answer. It's the Republicans who seem to be having the problem with this tax bill.
Yeah, I will. I can describe it, but I really can't explain it. I would have thought that they would have found a way to make some minor adjustments to address their concerns, but it has become very political. And at this point, I think it's sort of on its last breath and pretty unlikely to be enacted this year. But all of those issues, the three larger business provisions that were in there, R&D, bonus depreciation, and the interest limitation, as well as the child tax credit changes, all of those would, even if this bill were enacted, would have to be addressed again next year, because it was only a short-term extension on all of those.
So one of the other questions that you haven't addressed, but everyone is talking about, is the wealth tax. As we learned in our survey this year, 5% of the respondents, which doesn't sound like a very high percent, but their biggest tax concern, is a wealth tax. The reason that is notable is because last year it wasn't even on their radar. It was zero. So now people believe that wealth tax is a reality. And as we know, through the work we've done with Frank Lutz, 70% of the voters support a wealth tax. So maybe you can talk about the likelihood, the possibility of a wealth tax, and also, hopefully I'm not putting you on the spot here, but what are the possibilities of state wealth tax? As you guys know, I live in California, and there is a movement in California to have a state implemented wealth tax. I believe that it's not going to pass. That's the current consensus, but there's other states that are advocating for wealth tax. So if you could generally talk about that at a national and state level, that would be helpful.
Well, I will talk about the Democrats at the federal level, and And Mark hails from California too, so I let him take the California question. We should face reality. Support for a wealth tax or something like it is increasing among Democrats in Washington, D.C. It has not infected the Republican Party yet, but this year, Chairman Wyden of Oregon, chair of the Finance Committee, introduced legislation. He called it the billionaire's tax, and he had 18 Democratic senators joined him on that legislation. That's more than we've ever had before on a wealth tax at the federal level. And so moves it beyond just the Bernie Sanders and the Elizabeth Warrens of the conference, the Democratic conference. And of course, that bill is not just for billionaires. When you look at the details, if you have 100 million in income, you'd be subject to it. If you have a trust and you had 10 million in income in the trust, you'd be subject to it. So you have to be careful to look at these details. I don't think it's going to pass. It's certainly not going to pass this year. I don't think it would even pass if we had a Democratic sweep. But components of the idea of taxing annually appreciation and wealth, some component of that could get incorporated into another provision. And Mark described one of those possibilities would be, well, let's just increase the alternative minimum tax or a minimum tax on wealthy individuals and slip the concept of appreciated property into that sort of structure. And so that's really what we'll be fighting here in the next year or two.
And on that note, there's a Supreme Court case right now that was taken up ostensibly to deal with a tax on unrealized gains. I think the consensus is it probably won't be decided on that grounds. There's another way for them to deal with it. It's an international tax provision from the 2017 bill. But given that 4 justices thought it was important enough, and this came out of the Ninth Circuit, the original case, I won't be surprised if there's some language in one of their concurring opinions, some dicta that would throw some cold water on taxing unrealized gains. So a wealth tax that would incorporate that could be constitutionally suspect after this case, and likely to generate a lot more litigation going forward. And Pat, just quickly on the California and the state level, I think California, I think everybody's looked to as sort of a potential leader there, as well as with New York and maybe Massachusetts, to try and take up a wealth tax. I was really surprised, or I guess not surprised, that the most recent version got through the legislature, but that the governor threw cold water on it. So, I guess I agree with Russ that at a federal level, it probably will be quite a bit further down the road before the states get, close to or to the point where they think they have the public support to be able to do that. And then, there are always constitutional provisions in the state constitutions that can stand in the way. And that's really a state by state kind of analysis.
Mark, on that point, is it possible that the states could lead here? In other words, maybe there's not a wealth tax at the national level, but if enough states start imposing it at state level, maybe the national will, take a harder look at it. And as Russ said, it could be ingrained in other sorts of legislation.
Absolutely. But doing it at a federal level, you have to deal with the constitutional limitations. And so if there is, either from this Supreme Court case or depending on how you design it, there could be problems just at the federal level with trying to do a wealth tax, because you don't get as much money out of it if you are only taxing wealth based on what's realized. Most of the wealth is in appreciated property that under current principles you don't see a tax on that gain until it's actually the owner gets some benefit from it.
So I know that Luke Walwork has joined us, but before we start with him, I have 2 more areas that I would like to have Russ and Mark quickly talk about, because they are very important. to our family businesses and also our family offices, successful individual on this call, and remind everybody that much of what Russ and Mark are talking about relates to not only family businesses, but family offices and successful individuals as well. In fact, as most of you know, single family offices tend to be family businesses in of itself. So one of the issues that I know family offices are concerned about, and we are paying attention to it, we don't work as hard on it as other issues, is the transparency, the Corporate Transparency Act. So maybe you could talk a little bit about where that is, and because obviously family offices are worried about the privacy issues associated with that act.
Well, that is the law, and businesses are required to comply by the end of this year. There are some exemptions for certain nonprofits and others, but you have to look in the details of those. But there is a court, I believe, a federal district court in Alabama that has blocked it, or basically ruled that it's inappropriate or unconstitutional.
Yep.
And so we have to see. If I were advising someone, I'd say, well, you can wait a little while here and see if, in fact, the higher court sort of backed that Alabama court, and you may not need to comply.
There are other similar cases working their way through other district courts across the country. So we may see parallel rulings or conflicting, in which case the Supreme Court may have to get involved.
So my last question quickly revolves around AI. So are we going to have legislation around AI? And if so, generally what do you think that would look like?
That's a very good question, Pat. I think it's an area that Congress is just starting to dip its toe into. I think we probably will have some regulation around it, but I don't think it's going to be fast. I think Congress is going to need to work its way through, because I don't think most people really even understand what AI even is, let alone how do we go about regulating it. So that's a story that's going to continue for quite a while, I think.
Okay, thank you for that. And thank you both. We may call on you before the end of the call. So now, Luke, if you want to turn on your video, we'd like to see you if possible. Luke, as I mentioned earlier, is the Member Services and Coalition Director for the House Small Business Committee. So Luke, welcome. Thank you for getting on the call today.
Yeah, happy to do it. I know you guys just had the tax experts on the call, so I won't delve too far into that topic. But I can just give a kind of a high overview of what the committee's been working on as it relates to small businesses and family businesses. We just had a markup today of 7 bipartisan bills. One of them deals with a program at the SBA called Small Business Investment Companies, and we added the ability, added some additional leverage that those SBICs can take on, and primarily what those SBICs do is invest in. It's an alternative investment function, and they invest in small businesses. I believe the cap is under $3 million. So that's great. We reported all 7 bills out by a vote of 23 to 0, which is really good. We work mostly in a bipartisan fashion when it comes to markups and reporting bills out of committee. We also on your question on the Corporate Transparency Act, we actually have a hearing coming up on April 30th about the Corporate Transparency Act, and really focusing on the implementation that FinCEN has done. As they said before us, it is law. As Russell said, it is a law. I believe it was passed in 2018 on a bipartisan basis, and the goal is to stop money laundering, right? But there has been significant concern from the small business and family business world about how onerous some of the reporting requirements are. And so we're going to hear from the National Small Business Association, which actually was the group that won the lawsuit in Alabama. So we're going to hear from one of their members. He's actually a lawyer, and he's a part of some working groups and things like that. And there's some of the law firms are actually some of the smaller law firms are actually telling them to not help their clients with the Corporate Transparency Act because they could actually be on the hook if something goes wrong. Then we're going to hear from an accountant as well, who helps small businesses with their taxes and with things like this. And he's also hearing from some of his folks in the industry that, hey, they're saying hands off on this because it could be considered practicing law. And so if you're a small business or a family business and your lawyer isn't willing to help you with this form and your accountant isn't willing to help you with this form, it's like, hey, where do we turn here? Because the vast majority of small businesses, I would say all small businesses and family businesses, want to comply with the law, but they don't have the expertise to go and to fill out these complicated forms. So we're gonna highlight that. It's something that a lot of folks are talking to us about. So that's one thing to kind of put on your radar. We also had a hearing earlier this year in Miss Van Dyne's subcommittee about the role of alternative investment in small businesses and family businesses. One of the not all small businesses want to stay small forever, right? Like they want to grow and they want to get bigger and they want to help their community and they want to employ people. And a lot of the times that takes that comes in the form of a non-traditional loan, right? They're not going to their bank down the road. It's like, no, like I want to take on a private equity investment, or if you're a startup, you want to go and find VC or angel capital or something like that. And so we highlighted that. One of the things that came out of that hearing was some real concern with what is happening over at the FTC and the DOJ when it comes to mergers and acquisitions. And one of the things, so we wrote a letter yesterday to the FTC and the DOJ on their M&A guidelines that they put out, because a lot of the times, hey, you start a family business and you grow and you build it, and then your kids grow up and hey, they don't want to take over the family business, and you want to have an exit strategy. And one of the things that we heard was that these guidelines that they're putting out are really having a chilling effect on the potential for those exit strategies. And so when I met, I think when the group was, or at least my initial interaction with you guys was back when I was with Dr. Murphy on the Ways and Means Committee, and I think Mark and Russell came in and sat down and chatted with me. So glad to talk to you guys. I'm happy to answer any questions or keep talking a little bit more. But those were a couple of things that I wanted to highlight for you guys.
Well, thank you very much for that, Luke. I guess it's very helpful to know the work that you're doing for small and family businesses. We really appreciate that. It's excellent to know that you're having these hearings and that the problems created with this Transparency Act that you've highlighted, which quite frankly, I wasn't unaware of. So appreciate that. And if there's anything our family businesses can do to help you and what you're trying to achieve, please let us know. Do you have some suggestions for us?
Yeah, no, I mean, Michael's been great to work with, and I've reached out to him a couple of times on some other topics, but yeah, I mean, anything, whether it's if you're hearing if Pat, you're hearing from your members about concerns and things like that, we would love a statement for the record or anything like that we can highlight. We're actually going to have it's about 300 letters for the record that small businesses have signed and said like, hey, we we're concerned about this, and while it's not in our jurisdiction, our legislative jurisdiction. It's obviously an impact that an issue that is kind of bubbling up as it's coming here. You have till the end of the year to submit this, and a lot of people are concerned, and there's legal uncertainty. One of the things with the lawsuit is it only applies to National Small Business Association members, and so if you aren't an NSBA member on March 1st of 2024, then you still have to comply. And so obviously there's going to be an appeal, and I think something like this could probably end up at the Supreme Court. I know they're doing some jurisdictional shopping. I don't think that's the correct legal term when it comes to finding a friendly court on this. So it's going to be interesting to see play out.
Well, thank you so much, Luke. We really appreciate you being on the call. Love to see you in person. Hopefully you'll have an opportunity to come to the Congressional Family Business Caucus May 14th of this year, so you can hear from our family business owners in person. And thank you for all that you're doing. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, happy to do it. Yeah, I'll pencil that in on my calendar, and just keep up the good work. I know you guys have some good co-chairs of the caucus as well, who are in some influential positions. So keep up the good work.
All right. Thank you so much for that. So now I'd like to turn it over to Ryan Dilworth, who is Legislative Director for Tax Issues for Representative Beth Van Dyne of Texas. Ryan, nice to have you join us today.
Appreciate you guys having me on, and appreciate the kind words from Luke. Definitely appreciate the shout out on the work we do on small business. We are happy to be on that committee, as well as Ways and Means, and it's a really nice way the two committees are able to complement each other. Luke's doing a great job over there, so we appreciate that. I understand you had some tax experts on earlier, and so don't want to steal their thunder, but would love to just give a brief update what we're doing, particularly in the Ways and Means Committee, since you heard a lot from Luke there on small business. But we are getting ready for the Super Bowl of tax, as the chairman's calling it, in 2025, with the expiring of the vast majority of the TCJA provisions, all really except for the corporate rate, which I think will still be a debate. I think we're going to hear from some of our friends on the other side of the aisle. Is using it as a pay for, and we saw that in the president's budget last year. And so the 199A, the kind of small business deduction, I think is at risk as well, as we see that expiring. But the administration and Democrats wanting to kind of match that with the corporate rate. So any corporate rate increase with the 199A is in threat there. But the chairman, I think, is putting together a good plan. We are looking at we're not calling them working groups, but kind of tax teams is what we're calling them, and they're putting together on a number of issues, from the personal rate to small business to energy, kind of all the buckets that we're looking at going into 2025. We'll hopefully find out which members are on those different teams and kind of taking leads, put up those and start brainstorming of ideas of how we can extend these taxes over the next 5 years. Many of our bosses like to see all of them permanent, but we understand, that's expensive, and the political will is not always there. So we will be getting to work on that soon. I know we are still, fingers crossed it doesn't look great, but we passed our, mini tax bill earlier this year, and still waiting on the Senate to take that up, and we're hopeful they do. But we don't have a lot of faith at this point. This was kind of last week we thought it had any sort of hope or opportunity. And we're educating a lot of members. It's fascinating on the Ways and Means Committee. Very few of the members were here in 2017, so there's a lot of new members. And I think that's something where, the advocates in the community and the ones who are actually paying taxes, educating members of what's important to them and what's helpful to them, I think is going to be an important job going to 2025, because on Ways and Means, and small business, one of the best messages we hear is from those businesses of what works for them, what problems they run into. In ways and means, we've done, I think, 8 or 9 field hearings at this point, and we have a lot more planned. And that's where we've been driving our policy from, is going out into the country, getting out of, the bubble of DC, and actually hearing from people of what challenges they're having and how we can be helpful. I don't want to monopolize all the time, so happy to take some questions and elaborate on anything else as well.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for working on those taxes that are going to expire 2025 or and increase all of our taxes at all levels. We think that's very, very important as well. Of course, we agree with you. We're working on it as well. So we absolutely want to help you in any way that we can. So please let us know how we can do that. It is very, very important to family businesses that the estate tax exemption stays where it is, and hopefully the rate can go down, and 199A is restored, bonus depreciation, R&D expensing, all of the things that are important to family businesses, successful individuals, and family offices in this country. And we're happy to hear you say that you are working on it. So please let us know how we can help you and your boss to accomplish this feat, which I think is going to be a pretty heavy lift, but we're all working on it now. So maybe when we get there, we'll have a good outcome.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, just continue to tell your story. I think oftentimes when people talk tax policy, they just think big corporations and don't realize, who's actually paying these taxes and how businesses run and how beneficial many of the things we did in 2017 were. Put the nail on the head on the R&D and the bonus depreciation. I think both those are very helpful. And, we talk to businesses all the time. That's incentivized them to go put money back into their business, back into their employees. And that's a story that I think is often doesn't rise to the top as much as it should.
I totally agree. Well, thank you so much for being on this call today. Really appreciate your time and really appreciate all the work that you're doing to help all of our families.
Of course, and look forward to working with you all, and would love to continue, the conversation down the road.
Okay. With the few minutes that we have remaining, I would like Michael Hawthorne to please give us a brief update on what is happening with the Congressional Family Business Caucus.
Thanks, Pat. Michael Hawthorne, I'm an associate with Squire Patton Boggs. Over the past 1.5 years, I've been working with FEUSA and Pat on supporting the Congressional Family Business Caucus. I'm proud to say, as of today, the caucus has grown to 42 members in the House, thanks in large part to the support of all of the members on the call, including the members that participated in our most recent March event in Washington, D.C. that Pat mentioned earlier. As a reminder for those of you that might be less familiar, the Congressional Family Business Caucus is a bipartisan educational caucus formed in the House to bring awareness to the issues currently facing family-owned businesses. And a large part of how the caucus is achieving that goal is bringing together members of Congress and their staff, like Ryan and Luke, with family-owned businesses in the room from across the country, including businesses from the caucus members' states and regions. The caucus is currently led by Representatives Jody Arrington of Texas, Brad Schneider of Illinois, Claudia Tenney of New York, and Henry Cuellar of Texas. And in addition to our 4 co-chairs, the caucus includes a bipartisan group of members from various backgrounds and regions across the country, including some owners of family businesses themselves, such as family construction firms and medical practices. As we mentioned before on the call, this March, FEUSA hosted an event in coordination with the caucus that focused on workplace issues. During the event, a panel of FEUSA and Policy and Taxation Group members and their employees shared their stories with members of Congress who were present, including their commitment to workforce development and providing above-average employee benefits. And the members that were present got a chance to speak directly to their elected representatives about the impact that those issues have on their businesses, their ability to retain talent, train their employees, and operate in the future. The event was attended by 6 members of Congress, which was a record for one of our caucus events thus far. So we were really proud to have so many members of Congress in the room, including 3 of our caucus co-chairs. And the March event also featured Capitol Hill meetings where FEUSA and Policy and Taxation Group members got to meet directly with their members of Congress from their home state and districts and ask their members to join the caucus. This May, as Pat has also mentioned on the call, FEUSA will host another event in coordination with the caucus. This May's event will be focused on succession issues, which we hope to have several of you participate in and join meetings with your elected representatives as well. But we look forward to working with you and working on the caucus in 2024 and achieving our goal of 50 caucus members by year end. I know I'm optimistic that we'll get there. I think Pat's optimistic as well. But thank you again for your continued outreach and your support of the caucus, and we hope to see you in DC soon.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for all your hard work and Pratik's work and everyone else on the DC team in building this caucus to where it is today. We are very proud of it. Before we conclude this call, I just want to answer one question that was in the Q&A, and that revolves around R&D expensing. R&D expensing is not dead. I don't believe it's dead. Mark and Russ can weigh in quickly, but it does have bipartisan support to restore R&D expensing versus capitalization. So I'm hoping that even though this tax bill that's at the Senate won't go anywhere, that R&D expensing is something that's still on the table. Mark and Russ, do you have a quick comment?
Yeah, I agree with you, Pat. I think this will definitely be an issue next year. And of the 3 that are in this bill, it certainly has the most bipartisan support, and I think has the most visibility. So, and importance. So it will definitely be front and center as part of the discussion next year, and I think has a decent chance of getting restored back to full deductibility, probably limited, as in this bill, to domestic research. And they'll carve out and make foreign research amortized still.
Thanks, Mark. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We're at the end of our time. Really appreciate the comments by all of our panelists and speakers and all of you and your support. Please continue to support our work if you're doing it. If you're not, we can't do it without you. This is going to be a very busy this year and next year. So we hope you'll go to our websites and support what we do. Thank you all, and everyone have a great rest of your day. Take care.